Did you know that in the Middle Ages, a time stretching from the 5th to the 15th century, women could supposedly own businesses, manage huge estates, and even take their husbands to court? Get ready to challenge everything you thought you knew about medieval women's legal rights. Number 7. Medieval women were legally invisible, unable to own property or money. Many people think medieval women simply had no control over anything valuable, that their money and property instantly belonged to their husbands. But delve deeper into the dusty parchment rolls, and you find a different picture. A powerful legal concept called dower existed across much of Europe, especially in England under common law. Dower was not a gift from a loving husband, it was a wife's legal right to a portion of her husband's land or income if he died before her. Typically, this was 1/3 of his real estate, and she held it for the rest of her life. This guaranteed her a means of support and a certain level of independence as a widow. It meant she could not be left destitute. The royal charters and legal treatises from the 13th century, including the famous Magna Carta, contained clauses specifically protecting a widow's right to her dower, ensuring she received it quickly and without trouble. This shows just how significant and accepted this right was within the legal system. Consider the case of Eleanor of Aquitaine, a woman who lived in the 12th century. She was Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, inheriting vast lands. But even beyond her inherent power, when her first marriage to Louis VII of France ended, and she later became Queen of England through her marriage to Henry II, she would have been entitled to dower lands from Louis's estate had she been widowed. These kinds of legal protections ensured a certain level of financial security for women across different social levels. A less famous but equally important example could be found in a small English village. If a peasant woman's husband died, leaving behind a small plot of land or even just tenancy rights, she, as his widow, would often be able to continue living on and drawing income from a portion of that land, often enough to feed herself and her children. This wasn't a charity, it was her legal due, recorded in manorial court rolls. Beyond dower, some medieval women possessed the status of feme sole, which translates to woman alone. This legal standing was especially common in bustling urban centers like London, Bristol, and York in England, and in many towns on the continent. A single woman, a widow, or, in specific circumstances, even a married woman whose husband was away or a foreigner, could be recognized as a feme sole. This allowed her to conduct business, enter into contracts, buy and sell property, and even sue and be sued in court, all in her own name, without her husband's permission or involvement. If a woman running a successful bakery in 14th century London wanted to buy a new oven, she could sign the contract herself, and if the oven wasn't delivered, she could take the supplier to court directly. Her business debts were her own, not her husband's, which protected his assets and allowed her autonomy. Records from the City of London's archives show many instances of women engaged in trade under this special legal status. Furthermore, a significant amount of property entered a marriage not from the husband's side, but from the wife's. This was known as a dowry, or, in some European legal systems, a dote. This property, which could include land, money, goods, or even specific rights, was given by the bride's family to the groom, but it was often considered her property in law. While the husband typically managed this property during the marriage and used its income, it legally remained distinct from his own assets. If the marriage ended in annulment, or if the wife outlived her husband, the dowry often reverted to her or to her family. In some regions, like parts of Italy, women retained more control over their dowries even during marriage, sometimes needing to consent to its sale or use. This meant that a woman entering marriage often brought significant value with her, a value that was legally recognized as belonging to her, not just her husband. Inheritance also paints a complex picture. While primogeniture, where the eldest son inherited everything, was common for noble families and major estates, it was far from universal. If a family had no male heirs, daughters could and often did inherit land and titles. In such cases, the daughters would become co-parceners, meaning they shared the inheritance. This often led to important marriages that merged powerful families and vast estates. The legal custom in Scandinavia, for instance, often granted daughters more equitable inheritance rights to land than in other parts of Europe. Even in England, if a baron died without a son, his daughter or daughters would inherit his barony and lands, sometimes even his title, though the title itself would then be passed to their husbands. The famous example of Matilda, daughter of King Henry I of England, who fought fiercely to claim her inheritance of the English throne, showcases that even the highest offices could be contested on the basis of female inheritance, though it was certainly an uphill battle. These examples show that medieval women were far from invisible when it came to holding and managing property, even if their rights differed depending on their status, location, and the specific legal customs of their time. Number 6. Medieval women had no voice in their own marriages and were completely coerced. It is often assumed that medieval women were simply property to be exchanged, with no say whatsoever in who they married. While arranged marriages were definitely the norm, especially among the nobility and wealthy merchants, the church, which held immense power over social life, actually required the consent of both parties for a marriage to be legally valid. Without free consent, the marriage could be annulled, meaning it was considered never to have happened. This requirement meant that a woman, however pressured, still theoretically had a right to refuse. While it was incredibly difficult to defy family wishes, especially in a powerful household, records show cases where women did resist. Sometimes this resistance manifested in subtle ways, like a silent refusal to utter the vows, or a declared lack of consent in private. Consider the detailed rules laid out by canon law, the church's legal system. A marriage was defined by consent, not by ceremony or consummation alone. If a woman declared, even after a ceremony, that she had been forced and did not truly consent, the marriage could be investigated. These cases brought before ecclesiastical courts, the church courts often involved disputes over marriage validity, including claims of coercion. A woman might accuse her future husband of abduction, or her family of forcing her hand. While successfully proving a lack of consent against powerful family pressure was rare and fraught with difficulty, the legal mechanism was there. These courts also dealt with issues like pre-existing contracts, where a person was already promised to another, or kinship rules that forbade marriage between certain relatives. Women, sometimes with family support, sometimes alone, initiated these annulment suits. While direct refusal might have been rare for fear of family disapproval or social ostracism, the existence of legal channels for annulment offered a sliver of leverage. A woman could, for example, declare a pre-contract stating she had already exchanged vows with another man in secret. Such a claim, if proven, would invalidate the current marriage. This suggests that while formal choice was limited, medieval women were not entirely without agency in navigating the complex landscape of marital law. The legal importance of consent also meant that elopement, though risky and often scandalous, could sometimes be recognized by the church as a valid marriage if consent had been freely given between the couple. While such unions often meant social ruin or disinheritance, the fact that they were legally acknowledged by the church in some instances highlights the paramount importance of consent. Negotiations surrounding marriage, particularly for noble and wealthy families, often involved lengthy discussions about dowry and jointure. The dowry was the property or wealth the bride brought to the marriage, which, as explored before, often remained her legal property. Her jointure, on the other hand, was specific land or income settled on the bride before marriage, in place of her dower rights, guaranteeing her financial security as a widow. These negotiations, while conducted by the families, were profoundly important for the woman's future well-being. The discussions around her financial security were not just about money. They reflected her status and standing within the new family, and sometimes indirectly gave her family a bargaining chip to ensure she was not simply cast aside without resources. Legal scholars of the time, such as those documenting the custom of Paris in France, also dealt with questions of marital obligations and rights. While a husband held significant authority, the law also recognized a wife's entitlements. If a woman was deeply unhappy with a proposed marriage, and if she had sufficient family backing or a strong legal case, her refusal could sometimes break an engagement. The potential for a scandal, a public annulment trial, or a long-standing feud could sometimes be enough to deter a family from forcing an unwilling daughter into an unsuitable match, especially if the girl was from a powerful family herself. These subtle forms of resistance, while not a direct choice of partner, show that total coercion was not always the absolute rule. Number 5, medieval women were completely subordinate to men, always under male guardianship, with no legal independence. It is a common belief that medieval women were perpetually under the legal control of a father, brother, or husband. This idea paints a picture of constant dependency. However, legal systems across Europe recognize specific circumstances where women achieve significant independence and authority. Widows, for example, were often legally autonomous. Upon the death of her husband, a widow typically regained control over her property and her person. She could enter into contracts, buy and sell land, sue and be sued, and conduct business in her own name without needing a male guardian. Many wealthy widows became powerful figures in their communities, managing vast estates, lending money, and even acting as guardians for their children, often preferring to manage their own affairs rather than remarry and relinquish their newfound independence. Consider the examples of women who ran businesses after their husbands passed away. A widow in a medieval town might take over her husband's thriving merchant business, managing accounts, apprentices, and trade routes. Records from the city of Florence show widowed women continuing their family's banking or textile businesses, sometimes expanding them significantly. A prominent example is Christine de Pizan, a widow in 15th century France, who not only supported her family through her writing, but also fiercely advocated for women's rights and abilities in her widely read works. Her very existence and success as a writer and intellectual relied on her legal independence as a widow. Another crucial example of female legal independence and power comes from the church abbesses. These women were the heads of powerful convents and monasteries, wielding immense spiritual, economic, and even political authority. An abbess managed vast estates, sometimes larger than those of many lords, overseeing numerous tenants and workers, both male and female. She was responsible for the spiritual well-being of her nuns, but also for the financial health of her institution. Abbesses often attended feudal councils, had jurisdiction over certain secular courts within their lands, and dealt directly with kings and popes. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century German abbess, was not only a renowned visionary, composer, and natural philosopher, but also a powerful political figure who corresponded with emperors and kings, and challenged powerful bishops. Abbess of Shaftesbury in England or Gandersheim in Germany were figures of significant power, holding feudal rights and exercising legal authority over their domains. Royal women also frequently stepped into roles of immense power and legal authority, especially as regents for their young sons. Blanche of Castile, the mother of King Louis IX of France, served as regent during his minority in the 13th century. She effectively ruled France, putting down rebellions, negotiating treaties, and making crucial political decisions. Her authority was not merely symbolic. It was real, legal, and executive power. Similarly, Eleanor of Aquitaine acted as regent for her son Richard the Lionheart during his absence on crusade, demonstrating practical, political, and administrative skills that went far beyond domestic concerns. These examples show women at the very pinnacle of power, exercising legal authority over entire kingdoms, disproving the notion of universal female subordination. The feme sole status, mentioned earlier, also highlights legal independence. While often discussed in terms of property, it fundamentally allowed a woman to escape coverture, the legal principle where a married woman's legal identity was covered by her husband's. As a feme sole, she was a distinct legal entity in her own right, able to sue and be sued, enter contracts, and manage her own affairs without her husband's involvement or permission. This was a critical legal tool for urban women engaged in business, granting them a level of autonomy that contradicts the idea of constant guardianship. These various examples from different strata of medieval society demonstrate that legal independence for women, while not universal, was a tangible reality for many, under various circumstances. Number 4. Medieval women could not work, run businesses, or contribute economically outside the home. The image of medieval women confined solely to household chores and child-rearing is a persistent one, yet it overlooks the immense and varied economic contributions women made. From the bustling streets of cities to the quiet fields of the countryside, women were essential to the medieval economy, often running businesses and engaging in trades that took them far beyond the domestic sphere. One of the most widespread female occupations was brewing and baking. In almost every town and village, alewives and bakeresses were common sights. These were often small-scale businesses, run from the home, but they involved managing supplies, producing goods, and selling them to customers. A woman making bread for sale at the market or brewing ale in her own home to sell to neighbors was an entrepreneur contributing directly to the local economy and earning her own income. Court records sometimes show these women involved in disputes over quality or debt, proving their active participation in commerce. The textile industry was perhaps the largest employer of women in the Middle Ages. From the spinning of raw wool or flax into thread to the weaving, dyeing, and finishing of cloth, women were central to every stage of this vital industry. Spinning was almost exclusively a female task, giving rise to the term spinster for an unmarried woman. In towns like Ghent, Bruges, or Florence, women worked in workshops, often within their homes, producing cloth that was traded across Europe. Some women even became masters of their craft. Silk weaving guilds in Paris, for instance, were composed entirely of women and run by women, demonstrating their full control over a specialized and valuable trade. They managed apprentices, purchased raw materials, and sold their finished luxury goods. Women were also prominent in retail and market vending. They ran stalls in town markets, selling everything from vegetables and eggs to poultry, fish, and small manufactured goods. Many women operated small shops or stalls, acting as independent traders. They managed their inventory, dealt with customers, and handled money. This was not just a sideline for many, it was the primary source of income for their families. A woman selling herbs and remedies in a market square or managing a fish stall by the docks was engaged in public economic activity, interacting daily with the wider community. Beyond these common roles, women also engaged in specialized trades. Midwifery was an essential and respected profession, with women providing crucial healthcare services, often being paid for their expertise. Female healers and apothecaries also practiced preparing and selling medicines. In port towns, women worked in the fish industry, cleaning, salting, and selling fish. In rural areas, peasant women were indispensable to agricultural labor. They worked alongside men in the fields, planting, weeding, harvesting, and tending to livestock. Their labor was critical for the survival of their families and the productivity of the feudal manor. The assumption that farming was solely a male domain is incorrect. Women's physical labor in the fields was fundamental to the medieval agricultural system. Even noblewomen, despite their privileged status, were not confined to idleness. While they did not typically engage in manual labor, they often managed vast estates in their husband's absence or during their widowhood. This involved overseeing accounts, dealing with tenants, managing household staff, supervising agricultural output, and sometimes even administering justice on their lands. These were significant managerial and economic responsibilities that directly contributed to the wealth and stability of their families in the feudal economy. These examples show that medieval women were integral, active, and visible participants in every facet of the medieval economy, both within and far beyond their homes. Number 3. Medieval women had no recourse in law. They couldn't sue or defend themselves in court. The idea that medieval women were entirely powerless in the face of legal disputes, unable to access justice or present their cases in court, is a significant misconception. In fact, women frequently appeared as parties to lawsuits, both as plaintiffs seeking justice and as defendants responding to accusations. Their presence in the legal arena was a common feature of medieval life, recorded in countless surviving court documents. Women brought cases before various types of courts: royal courts, manorial courts for peasants, urban borough courts for townspeople, and particularly the ecclesiastical or church courts. The church courts, which dealt with matters of marriage, divorce, legitimacy, wills, and moral offenses, were especially accessible to women. For instance, a woman could sue her husband for breach of a marriage contract, or for defamation if he slandered her reputation. She might bring a case against a neighbor for slander or assault. The widows frequently appeared in court to defend their dower rights or to ensure their inheritance was properly administered. Records from the English National Archives, such as the plea rolls of the King's Bench or Common Pleas, reveal numerous instances of women as litigants. A woman might sue a man for a debt owed to her, or for the return of her property. If her dower lands were withheld by her husband's heir, she could initiate a legal process to claim them. In local manorial courts, which handled disputes among peasants, women regularly participated in legal proceedings concerning land, trespass, and debt. A peasant woman might bring a case against a neighbor whose animals had damaged her crops, or defend herself against accusations of theft. While married women in some legal systems, particularly in England under coverture, often needed their husbands to represent them in secular courts, this did not mean they were legally invisible. They were still the principal parties to the case, and their interests were being litigated. Moreover, single women and widows consistently had the right to sue and be sued in their own names. The feme sole status in urban centers further empowered women to engage in legal proceedings independently, as discussed earlier. Women also regularly testified as witnesses in various legal proceedings. Their eyewitness accounts were considered valid and important for establishing facts in both secular and ecclesiastical courts. In cases of assault, rape, or theft, women's testimonies were crucial. The detailed court rolls from medieval towns and villages across Europe provide overwhelming evidence of women's direct and indirect involvement in the legal process. They were not merely passive bystanders, they were active participants, pursuing their rights, defending their reputations, and navigating the complex legal landscape of their time. The notion of medieval women being completely without legal recourse simply does not hold up when examining the vast body of historical legal records. Number 2. Medieval women were entirely barred from inheriting land or titles, even if they were the only children. The idea that medieval women were completely excluded from inheriting land or noble titles is a common misconception, often rooted in an overemphasis on primogeniture. While it is true that male heirs were generally preferred, and firstborn sons typically inherited entire estates, especially for the nobility, this was not an absolute rule. In numerous instances, medieval daughters inherited vast lands, powerful lordships, and even kingdoms, especially in the absence of male heirs. When a lord or landowner died without a son, his daughter or daughters would often become his heirs. This was known as inheriting as heir general, meaning the direct descendant, regardless of gender. If there was more than one daughter, the inheritance would typically be divided among them, and they would become co-parceners. These shared inheritances often involved complex legal arrangements and sometimes led to disputes, but they clearly show women inheriting substantial properties. For instance, in England, numerous baronies, which were titles and associated lands, passed through female lines when there were no sons. The powerful de Clare family, for example, saw their vast estates eventually divided among 3 daughters in the 14th century, each bringing immense wealth and influence to their respective husbands. Consider the case of Matilda of England, daughter of King Henry I in the 12th century. She was designated as her father's heir to the English throne, and though her claim was ultimately contested and led to civil war, her ability to put forth such a claim and fight for it for years demonstrates that even the highest political office could be considered inheritable by a woman in the absence of male heirs. Her fierce determination to claim her rightful inheritance, even against a powerful male contender, shows that the concept of female inheritance was very much a part of the legal and political landscape. Another striking example is Eleanor of Aquitaine, who inherited the vast Duchy of Aquitaine in southwestern France at the age of 15, making her one of the most powerful women in Europe in the 12th century. She inherited this immense territory because her father, Duke William X, died without a male heir. Her control over Aquitaine was not merely nominal, it was real, and she exerted significant authority over her lands. Her inheritance ultimately shaped the political map of Europe for centuries. Similarly, Joanna I of Naples, a queen in the 14th century, inherited the Kingdom of Naples in her own right, ruling for decades. These were not isolated incidents, but rather illustrations of a legal principle that, while favoring males, always allowed for female succession when male lines failed. And regional variations in customary law also played a significant role. In some parts of Europe, such as certain regions of Germany or Scandinavia, customary laws often allowed for more equitable inheritance practices, with daughters having stronger claims to land or other forms of property, even when sons were present. These local customs varied widely, preventing a single uniform rule of male-only inheritance across the entire medieval period and continent. While noble titles might be designed to prevent female succession, the land and wealth attached to them often transferred through the female line, making these heiresses immensely valuable marriage prospects and powerful figures in their own right. The reality is that the legal framework of the Middle Ages, while patriarchal, still provided numerous pathways for women to inherit significant wealth, property, and even positions of power. Number 1. Medieval women were confined to the domestic sphere and never engaged in public life or travel. The image of medieval women perpetually secluded within their homes, engaged only in domestic tasks, is a persistent myth that dramatically undervalues their active and varied lives. From queens to peasant women, medieval women regularly engaged in public life and traveled for diverse reasons, often over significant distances. Pilgrimage was a widespread and significant activity for women across all social classes. Devout women journeyed to local shrines, to major pilgrimage sites within their own countries like Canterbury in England or Rocamadour in France, and even embarked on arduous international journeys to Rome, Jerusalem, or Santiago de Compostela in Spain. These pilgrimages could last weeks, months, or even years, requiring women to travel alone or in groups, manage their own affairs, and navigate unfamiliar lands. Accounts from the period, such as those detailing the travels of Marjorie Kempe, a 15th century English mystic, show women moving freely through Europe, engaging with diverse communities, and experiencing the world far beyond their villages or towns. Trade and commerce also drew women into the public sphere and involved travel. Women often accompanied their merchant husbands on business trips to fairs and markets, or even undertook these journeys themselves. As discussed previously, women ran businesses, managed market stalls, and participated in trade networks. This necessitated travel to acquire goods, sell products, and attend seasonal markets and fairs, which were bustling centers of public life and economic activity. A woman selling textiles might travel to a major fair a few days' journey away to purchase raw materials or sell her finished cloth to distant merchants. Royal and noble women were deeply enmeshed in political life, often necessitating extensive travel and engagement in public duties. Queens frequently traveled with their courts, moving between various royal residences or accompanied their husbands on political or military campaigns. They participated in diplomacy, hosted ambassadors, and even acted as regents during their husbands' absences, as seen with Blanche of Castile or Eleanor of Aquitaine. These women were not just figureheads, they conducted serious political business, negotiated treaties, and managed international relations. Eleanor of Aquitaine, for example, traveled extensively across France and England, and even accompanied her first husband, Louis VII, on the Second Crusade to the Holy Land, a massive and perilous journey. A religious life also offered opportunities for women to travel and engage publicly. Nuns sometimes traveled for visitations between convents, to attend religious councils, or to establish new monastic foundations. Abbesses, as mentioned, wielded significant power and often traveled to meet with bishops, kings, or other important figures to discuss legal or financial matters pertaining to their abbeys. Their public presence was recognized and respected. While less common, some women also engaged in warfare or defended castles during sieges. While not typically combatants, women in besieged castles often played vital roles in defense, organizing supplies, tending to the wounded, or even taking up arms when necessary. Joan of Arc is a famous and exceptional example, but countless unnamed women across medieval Europe contributed to the defense of their communities, a role far from the domestic sphere. Even for ordinary women, daily life involved frequent engagement with the public world. They went to markets, attended church services, fetched water from communal wells, visited neighbors, and participated in community festivals and celebrations. Peasant women spent significant portions of their days working in the fields, a very public and physically demanding activity. The idea of total confinement to the home is a romanticized notion, largely a product of later centuries, and does not reflect the dynamic and often arduous realities of medieval women's lives. Medieval women were active, visible, and indispensable participants in the public and economic life of their times, traveling and engaging in ways far beyond what many people commonly imagine.